It took overtime and Mark Scheifele's 300th goal to get the victory against the Chicago Blackhawks, but the Jets did take care of business. Find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, the Jets just finished defeating the Chicago Blackhawks 2-1 in overtime. Mark Scheifele's 300th career goal. Vibes were happy, but for a lot of this game, it definitely wasn't, I would say, the most exciting affair. And I think there were some, points of note for maybe things to improve upon, things to keep an eye out for. And later in the show, we're going to talk about maybe some observations through Arniel's first couple of games. Obviously, it's very premature to really give a detailed overview, but I think there's a couple of early, positives and maybe some things that I'm concerned about that we'll chat about later this show. But let's start off with Jets versus Hawks. Before we dive into the game, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed by visiting FanDuel.com right now and get started there. So, Jets versus Hawks. This was a game in which, I kind of prefaced it by saying that Chicago was not the pushover it was in years past. But I would say for Winnipeg, this is not a team that you can necessarily take lightly, but also you're expected to beat, right? The Chicago Blackhawks are, by all means, rebuilders. They are not a good team. They are not deep. And despite adding lots of free agent talent in the offseason, you look at the kinds of players they've added, guys like Pat Maroon, Alec Martinez, and yes, those guys have won rings elsewhere, and I think in some ways that's a great benefit to have on a team like Chicago where they're not really trying to compete, but Connor Bedard is trying to learn at this level of hockey, get used to being an everyday NHL pro, and having guys who have been there, who have walked the walk and done all that you can possibly do by, hoisting a Stanley Cup, perhaps more than once in some cases. I think it's a great leadership thing for him to kind of become the face of the franchise and eventually of that locker room. But, as it is right now, this is absolutely a team that the Jets should have beat. And Winnipeg did, but it took a lot of effort. And I think this game kind of showed some stuff that I talked about earlier on previous episodes where Winnipeg has to be 5 to 10% better. And that will come with internal adjustments. That'll come with some of the rookies at some point. It's just as the team is right now, they are a good team, but they're not like world beaters. And I think that that's kind of where I continue to have some reservations about, some of the changes and some of the directions that the Jets have suggested they're moving in part because I'm not sure how committed they are to any of these things, right? Like the youth movement they talked about in the offseason, but it's clear they're not really comfortable going that route yet, which, okay, if you're not really wanting to go that route, then don't talk it up. If you're not really feeling like this is going to be the year, then don't focus on that in the offseason and make it seem like that is your primary direction. If you run it back, like this is still a relatively strong playoff team, but again, once you actually get to the playoffs, that's where Winnipeg's problems have typically shown up. And I think in this case, this team is even weaker than it was last year on paper, so I'm not really expecting a deep playoff run unless the Jets have a big composition change and a new lineup by the time the playoffs roll around, which is possible, right? A lot can happen in the next 80 games. But I think for the Jets, this game was a sign that, for as strong as the Jets are, there's still a number of problems with, the goal scoring output and really the skill lines. And I want to focus on the skill lines later this show because those two, the Scheifele line and the Ehlers line, both struggling in some capacity, one a lot more than the other. to me, it kind of says that there's still work to be done. And, I've talked about advocating for a change, but, we'll save that for a little bit later this show. In this game, I think what stood out was that, the depth lines really did try to carry the load, and they played really well. The Lowry and Kupari lines were great. But what I mentioned earlier about them not likely shooting 30% for the rest of the season immediately showed up in this game. When you kind of get all of your goal scoring out against the Oilers, yes, it was a great time. The Lowry line accounted for 7 points total, and the Kupari line had a goal, and it was fun. It was great. But you don't really expect that to continue throughout the whole season, and it's why I really advocated for somebody like Shibrakov to maybe get a look. Now, you don't have to completely blow up your bottom six and add 2 to 3 rookies, but I think Shibrakov legitimately had the firepower and skill to add more finishing. I think that that's something that's a little underrated. And look, that's not really a knock on any of the players who are there. It's just when you're talking about how to internally improve and really give yourself insurance in case, say, the top six goes dry, this is how you do it. I think it's especially salient when you're talking about the Lowry line, because the Lowry line, for all intents and purposes, plays as your second line. They eat tons of minutes, and as a result of basically being the second most used line, that means that you kind of need them to score a lot, and they don't. That's a traditionally big problem with them, and it's really the one thing that they don't do. They do everything else amazingly well. Zone possession, forechecking, two-way defensive work. They are a beast at all of the right stuff, but then the one area that you need to win games, which is goals, they just significantly underperform what you would expect. And it makes it a weird dynamic for this team because they've got a great, great line that could actually be, a menace, and perhaps if they add finishing to it, a legitimate second line. But as it is constructed right now, it's just not quite there. And that's not to knock Niederreiter, Lowry, or Appleton. I think Niederreiter and Lowry could probably stay. I'd probably swap Appleton and Shibrakov. And Appleton, if you put him on the fourth line and you have something like, I don't know, Barron, Kupari, or Iafallo and Appleton, that's a beastly fourth line. Appleton has shown some really nice skill this year in the first couple of games. And if he adds that skill to your fourth, you could actually give that unit a little more ice time. And so I feel like, this is not really a knock per se on the bottom six. It's more like, how do you optimize these lines and get them to a point where you can basically roll 4 different units with different distributions that don't necessarily fit the old mold of your top six and your bottom six. The more flexibility and options that you add to this roster, the better off you'll be. Because the Jets tend to be the team that scores by committee. They don't have an elite first line in the traditional sense, or a superstar center or any of that stuff. What they've got is lots of really, really, really good players who can, help contribute to the overall team success and have a well-distributed amount of scoring across the team. But in order to make the most of that, you got to make sure that, your top lines are actually capable of putting the puck in the back of the net. And that's where I think guys like Shibrakov, who really have crazy releases, but are maybe capped at a middle six talent tier, might fit into this team. And in the past, the Jets were best when they were relying on ELCs on top of their veterans. I'm totally fine with the Jets not necessarily bringing up Lambert right now, because I think arguably, unless you had him in a third line role, I don't think, the fourth line role would necessarily be that helpful for him. But I think Shibrakov probably could have been a help in the game like this where, the margins are tight, there's not a lot of space, you're struggling to create chances, and then, at the end of it, the Jets were able to squeeze one out thanks to a bit of a line change, if you will. But again, we'll chat about that later. In terms of Scheifele, that was fun. He scored the game tying goal for $299 and then wanted an overtime with 300. About as, fairy tale of an evening as it gets for a guy like him who's really come a long way. Huge congrats to Scheifele, one of our longest tenured players, a very loyal guy to the club for the most part, and happy to see him, get to celebrate a personal milestone like this. It's not often that you have players who have been around Winnipeg as long as he has, and he's going to be around for the foreseeable future. So here's to many, many more goals in the future of his career. But I did mention that his line and the Oilers line maybe had some challenges in this game against the Hawks. I want to spend some time talking about that specifically because it comes up in many conversations. It led to some, comments and feedback in previous episodes that maybe I have a certain agenda against certain players on this team. And I promise you that's not really how I see it. But again, we'll talk about what changes could be potentially helpful and why the Jets maybe haven't done so yet in just a little bit. But before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. When it comes to the search for better, we're all driven to find top quality stuff, whether you're shopping for that special hockey jersey or maybe that special piece of memorabilia for the number one fan in your life. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. It's to match. And with Indeed, you can match with some of the top quality candidates in your discipline and beyond. Indeed helps you ditch the busy work by helping you schedule, screen, and message so you can do it all in one platform and connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't help you just hire faster. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality candidate matches compared to other job sites. And I've actually used Indeed myself when I was looking for work. I filled out a very straightforward resume builder. It actually also matched me with jobs that fit my work experience, my discipline and domains of interest, and also salary requirements, which is like a really big deal. And to have it do that very naturally, very smoothly, and even now I still get email updates with positions that actually do align with what my base of experience is, it's just great, right? And I can only imagine that for an employer trying to find top quality candidates in a competitive job market, it has to take so much of the burden off of you when you don't even have to think about it. You already get instant matches with top quality candidates. That's why 3.5 million businesses worldwide already use Indeed, and I recommend that you join them. Listeners of this show will even get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about us on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just talking about Winnipeg's effort against the Chicago Blackhawks. A fun comeback 2-1 victory that perhaps had about 40 or 50 minutes of angst and general frustration. And it wasn't for a lack of trying necessarily. It just felt like a lot of this team's offense is really coming from the bottom six right now. That's probably not a sustainable recipe for success. And you'll notice that this segment is called a skill line issue. And I think that's really relevant for the Jets because they've got the Scheifele line and the Ehlers line, and both of them have some particular quirks. Now, the Scheifele line has actually been performing around break-even-ish, I would say, in some of these games. The first couple of outings, they've been better than they were last year, right? What I think you do notice, though, is that this particular line has issues once it gets out of the offensive zone. And even in the offensive zone, I think you notice a lack of speed. Connor and Scheifele aren't slow, but it feels like when they're inside the OZ, they try to slow the game down in a way that I think allows defenders to generally frustrate them. And sometimes when they get time and space, they'll cook, right? Like there's no question that when they open space up, and you saw it in overtime when it was just Scheifele and Connor 3v3, they will find each other for beautiful, beautiful goals. But when you're at even strength and you're starting to see that they have issues creating at times, you'll notice that opponents will then counter off that and create offense at the other end. And their D zone work has, well, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of sucked. It's not been as bad as it was in previous years, and I think that that's a really important point to make. This game, they were like fine. I think that they were okay. And so, I think there's an argument that folks were making, like, why would you break it up then? And I think for me, the biggest problem with the top line is that it doesn't dominate, right? When you had Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde last year, they dominated offensive zone possession, which meant that you could do line changes and start to hem opponents in. If you prevented those breakouts and really stifled those neutral zone transitions and frankly just wore down opponents, it allows you to keep rolling four lines continually. It's how the 2017-2018 Jets used to hem in opponents for minutes at a time where they just could not get out of their own end. And the top line, when Ehlers is up there, does that. Now, I think there's been a fair bit of evidence that Ehlers in his first couple of games this year has been very bad. No question, he has not looked himself. And I think the reason that you're seeing that in this particular instance is I think he's trying to do too much. On his line, he's playing with Nemesnikov, who's probably ideally like a third or a fourth liner. And then you've got Perfetti, who, I think Perfetti is trying to play a different game. Ehlers is a very north-south, very quick, rapid cycling kind of player, and somebody who loves to use the perimeter to then attack the slot or the face-off circles, whereas Perfetti is kind of one of these guys who I can best describe as a tiki-taka sort of player. He doesn't have blazing speed. He's not like rushing up on counters, and his style of game, I think, is kind of an antithesis of how Ehlers plays. But it's why maybe he worked so well with Connor. Connor is the kind of guy who likes to slow down and attack those face-off circles and really be patient about picking his shooting lanes and spots, and then kind of drifting into those soft areas between coverages and unleashing a one-timer or something. And I think that's actually why he and Perfetti really kind of meshed. They don't have to blaze up and down the ice. Once they attack that offensive zone, they start using different triangles. They have different passing angles and lanes. And it gives them, like short little one-touch passes that allows them to dissect opponents. And when you have Perfetti, who's like a passing expert, versus Ehlers, who's really like a transition skating expert, I think that misalignment has led to Ehlers kind of trying to do like hero puck stuff, and it's just really not working out. No one seems to be on the same page, and that Nemesnikov line, in my mind, is almost unplayable. So I think having Ehlers move off of that unit would be a huge benefit for everyone, most notably for Ehlers, because like as it is right now, he just doesn't really look like a functional NHLer, and that is something that we know he definitely is. So getting him off that line, I think, would help. Arniel did actually try that, but in my mind, I don't really think it was the way that I personally would have liked to have done it. Niederreiter got a promotion. Ehlers was with Lowry and Appleton. That trio, in my mind, didn't really do much. Or was it? It might have been that Appleton was on a different line. I don't exactly remember the combos. Obviously, Arniel went to the line blenders, but Ehlers was with Lowry. I think that's the biggest thing. And like they were okay, but I think the biggest problem is that the first line was still up as is. And again, the first line in this game was like fine-ish. They created a fair number of chances. They also gave a decent number of opportunities up. And I think it's when they let up those counters that you kind of see where, the offense sort of dying in their own or in the offensive zone becomes a problem for them, because they're not really able to track back aggressively and really get back in time to help the defense out. So what I would do again is just swap Ehlers and Connor. I think it's a very simple fix, and I think you saw immediately when Ehlers had that one shift where it was like a late change. Connor came off early. Ehlers was on with Scheifele and Velarde. Immediately they created a scoring chance that I think came from Josh Morrissey, was it? Or it might have been Sandberg who actually took the shot. But immediately you just saw a natural chemistry with the passing and stuff that doesn't happen when Ehlers is off that line. And, you look at the empty net situation later in the game when the Jets had to pull the goalie. Guess who assisted on the game-tying goal? It was Nikolai Ehlers. Instead of cycling the puck up high, he went down low. He created a rebound off the goalie, and Scheifele took advantage. Now, you could argue that, sure, okay, that's not like the traditional way that we think about Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde dominating, but the whole point is that when they're together, they tend to just create offense in a way that outscores the opponents. They find ways in either finishing rebounds, setting up beautiful little tiki-taka passes, all sorts of different methods of scoring where when they're on the ice together, they're just better for each other. It's not really a criticism so much of Ehlers or Connor that they're struggling in the particular ways that they are. And I wouldn't even say Connor was struggling. I think he's been fine. I think Ehlers has definitely struggled, no question about that. But it's more like, how do you bring out the best in your players? And I think that's where those combos probably need a rethink. It's a big enough problem to where it weighs down the rest of the team. It's been a problem for years. I know why the Jets think it works and why they try to do it this way, but I promise you, if you go back to Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde as your first line, it'll make so much else work out a lot more smoothly. And even if it doesn't, at worst, you'll at least still be able to control the pace of the game. As it is right now, Winnipeg has not really had as close of the control as it might look like on the score sheet. And I think that's going to be a continual problem against better quality opponents. I think right now they've gotten away with some stuff against teams that weren't necessarily as organized. And it's crazy to say that about a Stanley Cup finalist in Edmonton, but that first game for them was not great at all. Sure, they definitely peppered Hellebuck, but the way that they played, there was a lot more space, a lot more gapping, and some really poor marking and defending that let the Jets just kind of carve them up. So, food for thought. I think that there's definitely some good stuff from this game and some things that are very frustrating and kind of things that I've pointed out before. I don't want to see it this early already, but at least if Arniel is maybe able to recognize it and see it, perhaps he'll be a little more open-minded and be willing to consider some changes. Speaking of Arniel, about that, I do have some thoughts from his first couple of games. And again, it is only a couple of games. We don't have like a huge sample size to work with between this and preseason and the regular season. All that said, though, I'm not really feeling as much has been changed as I think I was expecting. So we'll chat about that in just a little bit. But before we go into Arniel's current tenure so far, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. For those of you following the NFL action, we're now into week 6. It is getting pretty intense. As a Ravens fan, I think I've probably had a few heart palpitations the last few weeks. Probably had game of the season between the Bengals and Ravens, at least so far. Inevitably, there will probably be something even crazier this year. But for a lot of you Vikings fans, it's been a heck of a start. An amazing defense, quarterbacking that doesn't make your eyes bleed necessarily, and a team that just seems to have enough, marking other opponents that they've had a really great run to start the season. And if you're watching these games and you're getting a hunch in the middle of the game, you can also check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more to confirm your suspicions. And it's all on the same page where you place your bets. And when you get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, all you have to do is place your first $5 bet. That's it, $5, and you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed to win even more. That's only with FanDuel.com. Go to FanDuel.com right now and check in on all of the hottest action with America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about Winnipeg versus Chicago and really thinking a little bit higher level. How have the first several games under Scott Arniel looked, right? We have 2 regular season games and a handful of preseason games. And so, okay, it is a little bit of a smaller sample size, but I think you can take away the first really big high-level thing that I've noticed is that he's not really that different from Bonus. I feel like this team has some of the same strengths and some of the same weaknesses, which, for me, I'm not really loving. Part of Bonus that I very much enjoyed was that he had a rigid defensive structure and a team that tried to limit chances pretty effectively. I haven't really seen that part so much. I don't think this team is really built for that style of hockey anyways. But the thing that I am kind of bothered by is that the Connor Scheifele Velarde thing is still a concern. And, as much as I do love the Lowry line, if it continues to be used as like a second line, then it's going to have to score more. And I'm just not sure that it's going to be able to. It is a super effective, phenomenal forechecking line and really one that just wears opponents down. But for as much as they create, they just don't finish enough. And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for this unit unless they change up the composition of that third line. They do kind of need some sort of a scoring wing that can sub in for Appleton and add a bit more of a potent finishing touch. Because again, they get into all the right areas. They're constantly creating loads of chances. It's just that they don't have the individual scoring talent to make the most of it. In terms of other stuff with Arniel, I mean, he's got the special teams generally looking pretty good. I think the PK has done enough to stay afloat so far. They haven't conceded in a couple of opportunities. And that includes against the Oilers. I mean, it was only one power play, mind you, but hey, that's pretty nice. The power play has had some interesting, I would say, ups and downs. The ups are when they're in the offensive zone and they're set up. The passing is crisp. There's great cycling, really nice off the puck movement. And if they have any sort of space in the slot, that interchange between Ehlers and Scheifele as they swap those spaces along the bumper, it's phenomenal, and it has paid off pretty nicely. But then you also have moments where they struggle to set up and actually enter the zone and create. And like that is when the power play looks a lot like our old power plays where they just didn't get anything going. And I think that was exactly what you saw in tonight's game where the power play was just kind of not good. And I don't want to like hammer it home necessarily, but I do think you see some of the same habits and things that have haunted the Jets for a while. And I think it'll be a while before some of the stuff gets kicked to the curb and Arniel's full vision for the team is unveiled. But I'm starting to get the sense that Arniel's vision for the team isn't as different from the last team as I'd like. Not that the last team was bad or anything. No, I mean, they were a great regular season team. They had one of the best seasons in Jets 2.0 history. It's just that you kind of knew that when they got to the playoffs, they'd probably not last long. This team is very well built for the regular season. It's the playoffs that continue to be a bit of a concern. And I know people will say, well, that's just one-off. It's a small sample size, yada, yada, yada. The Jets are perennial playoff makers, though, and we've seen them struggle year after year once they actually get into the picture. And I would just love for them to actually be able to win a series again. They really don't do it that often. And like for as many times as this team does make the postseason, they really don't have that much to show for it. They usually either crash out in the first round or in the second round if they make it. Their best run was, of course, losing in the conference finals, and that was the year that I was totally convinced the Jets were winning the Cup. I've never believed in a Cup-winning Jets team more than that one. And really, it should have won the Cup, to be honest. They were that good. So I don't know if Arniel is ready to get this team to that state yet, but I will give him some of the benefit of the doubt, but I will also express that I have some reservations from early signature or early signs that perhaps this team is not going to change as much as I would hope. I think the in-game adjustments he made in this first game against the Hawks really didn't wow me. He swapped some players and changed some lines, but I didn't really feel like these were the kinds of changes that are going to have a meaningful impact on the final outcome. The one change that you really need to make, he did not. And so I just feel a little bit of a mixed bag. I don't think he's been bad or anything. And I'm not really going to write a specific assessment or assign a letter grade just a couple of games in, but I'm feeling a lot like this is more bonus than I think I'd like. I'm hoping that, maybe this is just a bit of a premature assumption. I'm reading too much into things. But I would like it if Arniel starts to really show some of his own ideas over the next couple of weeks. We haven't really seen what his vision for the team is yet. He's talked a lot about it, and he's, given some high-level descriptions, but I'm not yet seeing it on the ice. So, we'll have to take some time to wait for it and see if it actually does materialize. But so far, excuse me, I would say a little bumpier than I was expecting. So we'll have to keep an eye out. Obviously, the next game is going to be on the weekend against the Minnesota Wild. Minnesota should be an interesting test. They're a scrappy, annoying, very physical team, and it always seems like either somebody gets injured or suspended in one of these games. So let's just hope that we don't have another serious injury like we've had in previous games. But curious to know your thoughts on Arniel's first couple of games. Are you happy with the recent performances? What do you think about maybe considering some of the rookies in the next few weeks? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll be back here next week with some Minnesota Wild recap action and more. But as for tonight's episode, again, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.